World Religions is a program that seeks to inspire and inform people of faith about the world's great religions. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Sister Nancy Dawson.
Hello and welcome to this series, World Religions. I'm Father Jim Corda. Joining me in the series is Sister Nancy Dawson. I'm so glad you're with us today.
And I'm glad to be back. I really enjoyed being a part of the mission and ministry of CTNY. You've done so much wonderful work in communication, and your leadership has certainly been a real gift to the church at this time.
Well, thank you. We certainly appreciate your presence. I recall going back to the beginnings of our communication efforts where you were very fundamental in that. Several awards you won, brought the diocese into the modern communication world, and it's nice to have you with us in this series, which I think is very important. We're talking about different denominations. We spend time talking about the Islamic community, the Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, the Jewish community as well, and spend some time obviously with our own tradition, Catholicism and Protestantism. Now we're going to talk about the Orthodox Church. We go in to this understanding that we do not know everything about it, but what we will share will be enough to give those folks that are with us an appreciation of the richness and the tradition of the Orthodox community. Let's start with historical, the split between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox. We know it started in 1054 with the Great Schism. What historically was going on? Why did that happen?
I believe that term filioque kind of summarizes a little bit of what the distinction one of the distinctions that might have been the cause of the split. And it's my understanding that when we talk about God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that the question was, where did the Spirit come from? I could be wrong on this, but did the Spirit come from God the Father, or did the Spirit come from God the Father and God the Son?
Hence the word filioque in Latin,
here,
and the Son.
And so I think that was one of the issues. And I'm not sure if the papacy was another one or not. I think it might have been another issue that was dealt with in the split at that particular time. And of course there were some real key figures that we talk about in the West and in the East. Benedict in the West, and his contribution, I think, in history is most significant. I mean, he was known for most of the writings, I think, that we have on monastic life.
Yes.
What their ritual would be, what their prayers would be. Like all of this, 150 Psalms, I think. You know, he was very instrumental in determining that life. They were allowed to drink wine, but they were to labor, which I think is still part of some of the monastic traditions today. So I think he was very instrumental in some of the writings for the Western Church at that particular time in history.
Let's talk a little bit more about monasticism, because I think that gives us a sense of the tradition within the Orthodox community. What exactly is a monastic life?
I think it's a life where people, men and women, try to spend more of a journey into their personal relationship with the other, with God. Mm-hmm. There is a communal dimension to it, but I think that it is an inner journey. I think it's a special call that people come and they spend their day in labor and in prayer of the Psalms and in the chants. They see a lot of value in the music that they use. Thomas Merton does a wonderful job on explaining this. I just listened to a series on Sufism, and what he tried to do was to show how the Sufis feel that God is as close as your jugular vein, and then he tries to apply that to the monastic life that he was living at the time. This was in his very early years in monasticism. So I think it's not being separate from the world, but that your world becomes your heart. So there is a cosmic dimension to monastic life because you're embracing the whole world in your prayer. So some folks think, well, you just go off by yourself and that's it, and you begin to turn in on yourself. I remember one time one of the novices came to Thomas Merton, and of course he's the guru, my guru anytime in terms of the mystical life. And he said to him, well, Father, what stage am I at in those hierarchies of how you get to heaven? And Merton said, go do the dishes in the kitchen. If you're preoccupied with the ego, and am I getting there? He dismissed that question. But it gives you an example of monastic life. I think it's tough. I think it's tough because you're dealing with a small group of people. But in the Eastern faith traditions, with Basil as the person, in Greece, I guess they have these huge mountain Athos. Is that it?
Yes.
And there's like 25 monasteries there. And every one of those monasteries is filled with people who have gone to the monastic life. So there's something that attracts people to these places. And when the monasteries originally were built there in Greece, that's in the Eastern tradition, they were built all cement, way up, because the pirates used to come and steal everything. But I think that the life is a beautiful life as one's called to it.
And I think that's the fundamental thing, is that one is called to monasticism. It's not just something for everybody. Even within our own Catholic tradition, we have religious women and men who are called to the monastic life, a life of prayer and contemplation, where they kind of close themselves off from the outside world, where they can focus on God and in what's important. In that whole, as you were talking about Mount Athos in Greece, I call to mind the other Orthodox monasteries around the country and around the world where, for example, St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai in the Negev there. And so there's that whole sense that these were built for people of faith to come together to worship God, to close themselves off from the outside world, and to just celebrate who they are as people of God. Yeah.
I know that in some of the seasons of the year when there were changes, that the monks who originally would go out and beg for food, for example, and from the people in the area. And a lot of times these monasteries have been in areas that are in the city too. I mean, we talked about the ideal one on the mountain, but sometimes these little monasteries will be in the city. And then when the monks cannot go out, that is when they did a lot of the writing that they did that has been passed on to us from this particular tradition, as well as the art. Yeah.
Let's go to that word Orthodox. We know that the word Orthodox basically means, if you could translate it as correct belief. What was the correct belief fundamentally that you believe that they were celebrating, that they were talking about?
Well, don't you think that's kind of summarized in the Nicene Creed?
Exactly.
Yeah, we find a summary of what they believe, which we use,
Yes.
And I think that's one of the common denominators. I think the whole belief system is summarized right there in that creed.
And I think, if I remember historically, more recently, Pope Emeritus Benedict met with the Orthodox Patriarch. And then in their celebration, if I remember, Pope Emeritus Benedict eliminated the filioque when they gathered.
Yes.
To say the Nicene Creed.
Yes.
So there's this dialogue that continues in this life and in this world today with the Orthodox Church.
The rituals are unbelievable, aren't they?
Let's talk about that. One of the things that they're known for is their iconostasis. When you go into an Orthodox church, there is this decorated icon structure that's there that separates the community from the holy action that happens on the altar. What is your experience with the iconostasis?
I have not had that experience in the Orthodox Church that I've been in, which is the Catholic Orthodox Church. We might want to say something about that. There is the Catholic Orthodox.
Let's explain that.
And in that particular church that I went into, you did not see that division. It wasn't there, so that has not been my experience, but you're saying that it had been yours. You
Yes,
saw that.
yes.
So there's a separation. But remember, too, in the Jewish tradition, there was originally the curtain. You can see a similarity there that
Yes.
came down, so that there was a separation there, too, as part of their structure, church structure, or their synagogue structure, not their church. So you see that division. And then even in our own tradition, when you had the altar facing the wall,
Yes.
and so there's remnants of that, not just in that particular church, but the art, I think, is what is so expressive
Yes.
there.
And I think the Orthodox community is definitely known for their icons.
Oh, yes.
The beauty of something that is so fundamental in a two-dimensional bas relief type of way that says something about our faith and about Christianity. In your experience of icons, what do you think that they're trying to tell us?
I think the colors tell us something. You see a lot of the gold, the richness of the gold, and the reds. And there's something mystical about some of their figures, the elongated faces of Jesus. I have one right now in our chapel on Elm Street, one of the icons of Jesus. And to look at it, there's a richness in it. There is a depth in it. There's a perspective. And they're triptychs where you can open them up. I've seen some of those that are so beautiful. A lot of times you will see Mary, you will see the Madonna as one of the figures that is so ornately presented as being very central in that particular art form that you see.
We're going to talk about Mary in a little bit, but let's go back to the colors of the icons. I actually happen to have some descriptions of what the colors actually mean. You had mentioned gold.
Yes.
Gold is basically indicative of the radiance of heaven. So whenever you have gold in an icon, that tells you of the glory and the shining forth of the heavenly realm. The color red signifies the divine life. So oftentimes in an icon of Jesus, his predominant color would be red, his divine life. The blue signifies the human life. And so as a reverse of that, oftentimes in an icon of Mary, the God-bearer, she is blue, and yet underneath is the red. And the flip side would be for Jesus as well. His would be red, but the inside would be blue. So there's that whole sense of the human and the divine.
The color blue. That's interesting. But that's another one of the issues, isn't it?
Exactly.
That in fact, theologically, that whole idea of Jesus being human and Jesus being divine, and you see it there displayed in an artistic form in color. That's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
And the other color that they use is the color white. And the color white is basically indicative of the light of God. And there's only two instances where the Orthodox, in their iconography, use white, and that is in the resurrection and in the transfiguration.
Oh my gosh.
So only those two icons celebrate the light of God. And how in our own faith, the transfiguration is called to not only celebrate us understanding Jesus as divine and human, but how we are called to be transfigured and changed. What's your experience about that?
Well, I just think about it in terms of the Gospels. For example, when you see Jesus in his humanity, in let's say Mark's Gospel, but then you see the divine Jesus in John's Gospel, it seems like that whole movement comes along not only in the Byzantine Rite, but also in the Catholic Roman Church, where we see this fitting in with our scriptures, and of course in the Catholic Byzantine scriptures also, in our own scriptures there, I see it.
I remember my experience of being in Israel and going up to the Mount of Transfiguration, Mount Tabor. And it's quite a trip up, and it's quite a trip down. There's only one way up and one way down. And this beautiful basilica that's on the top of Mount Tabor When you're there, you could see the surrounding countryside from all around you. And so there's this sense that when Jesus was on this mountaintop, that he overlooked really the entire world, and his whole sense of being changed and transfigured, and how important that is for us. But I remember the story of the Transfiguration. Not only was this experienced by Peter, James, and John, and they saw his glory, but they went down the mountain, and they were once again into reality. There was a man with his sick son who wanted Jesus to heal him. So they were on the mountain, understanding,
and then they go into the valleys.
And they went into the valley.
And isn't that what our life's all about, too?
Exactly.
We go from the mountain experiences to the valley experiences.
And the other light of God that the Orthodox have in their iconography is the resurrection, and how important that is in the Orthodox Church. We talked about that in our segment on Catholicism, where we talk about the death and the suffering and the passion. And the Orthodox do talk about the resurrection and how important that is for them.
Yeah, that is the emphasis there, whereas the other is, in our tradition, has been the crucifixion, definitely.
I remember going to an Orthodox Holy Saturday celebration, and of course in Greek, Christos aneste ek nekron, Christ is risen from the dead, and they repeat that several times, and there's that whole sense of, in this darkened church, they have their light, and then they recall that Christ has risen from the dead, and that is basically why we exist, is to be people of the resurrection.
The ritual's different, a little bit different in the ordering of the way things happen in the celebration. Maybe we could say something about that.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
One of the pictures that I saw was, it's not an ordinary ritual, is where the priest has the Eucharist, and the woman is bent over, and they place that cup on the head of the person. But the ordering of the Eucharist, I think, is a little bit different in that tradition, where the Eucharist comes first, and they have the procession where they go around the altar, whereas in our tradition, we begin with the readings, and so there's that kind of a different ordering to the ritual that is had there.
And then we want to say that as the Orthodox also celebrate the sacraments of the church as well. Baptism, Eucharist, and we would call it confirmation, they would call it chrismation. And the interesting thing within the Orthodox community is that one who is baptized as an infant receives all of those sacraments of initiation at once.
Yes.
So they receive confirmation, chrismation, and First Holy Communion, as well as baptism.
Which really was, in the early Catholic tradition, that was the order of sacraments of initiation.
Exactly.
Where you were not a full member of the church. And of course, there weren't babies then. I mean, the converts to the faith at that time were adult persons. That happened. So they're really going back to that order that originated at a much earlier time.
And I understand, for example, the sacrament of reconciliation is somewhat different in the Orthodox community, and that is where they would also use the icon as a form of being reconciled to God prior to going into the church. They would pray to the icon to ask the Lord to free them from their sins. They would light a candle in celebration of that, and then go in to celebrate their ritual as well. And how they ritualize what they are as a Eucharistic people.
Their vestments are absolutely ornate. They're gorgeous vestments. And I don't know how many bishops we have in that rite. I was talking to someone just recently, and I was asking about their, where their clergy are. I know that when I was studying in Washington, D.C. For a time at Catholic U, that right next door, we were living in a seminarian's house, but right next door is where they had the seminary during the year, and some of the residents were in what became the convent. But Celi Bigiani was there, and he was made a bishop, of course, and he's from the Youngstown area. And I found that interesting. So I was just trying to geographically locate, where all these folks are, because there seems to be a lot of transition in the leadership in the bishopric. So I don't know if they don't have enough bishops, but I'm not familiar with that particular element of the faith.
When we're talking about geography, we would probably be remiss if we did not talk about Rome and Constantinople.
Oh, yeah.
And let's talk about that historically, that change there in the life of the church, and even the emperor, actually, moving the seat from Rome to Constantinople.
And of course, that's when everything kind of fell apart at that time. And we already talked about the role of Constantine in doing that. So separation, in a sense, has always been a part of our history.
Yes.
Hasn't it?
Yes.
Sometimes the issues are big ones, sometimes they're small ones, and yet a richness that we can carry with us when these things happen.
And when we do talk about those differences that we have, it's important to focus on what unites us, those commonalities. And obviously, in the Orthodox Church, we believe in the succession of the bishops, the apostles. We believe in the Eucharist together. We celebrate that same real presence of Jesus in his body and in his blood. That whole celebration of who we are as a Catholic people with a small c. How important that is for us to recall that and to remember that.
And the whole sacramental system that we share.
Exactly. How and why is it important for us as Orthodox and Catholics to celebrate the sacraments? What does that do for us?
Well, I think it gives us a sense of what is universal. It gives us a sense of our own journeys in life and the commonalities of those. The moments in our life when we have a need for community support, we have a need to encounter Jesus in a very special way and for a very special purpose, if we're sick, for a special way of dealing with the saints or the folks that have come before us, like Basil, and the contributions that they made. And I think we need to be encouraged to study these faiths a lot more. I would have to admit, even in my own teaching, that I think there's a lot more that we can share that maybe we're not aware of. And so I think that an academic approach sometimes to learning the stories and the rituals and the music and the sharing is helpful. But I think those are the things that put us in common. They say that no matter what religion you're talking about, whether it's Orthodox or Hinduism or Buddhism, what makes a religion a religion? And they would say there's probably like 8 different things that bring all of us into that definition of what religion is. And the things they name is their stories, their creed, the Nicene Creed, their art form, what is their art experiences, what are their paintings, such as what we're doing right now.
Right.
In talking about the Byzantine faith. Of course, everybody has the beautiful stories. What is the emotional experience that comes from that faith? Is it one of fear? Is it one of love? Is it one of companionship? Is it one of being born again, or whatever it might be? But these are some of the common denominators, the ritual. So a faith may not have all of these things, but it's a basis of commonality where we could sit down and talk about, the East and the West and the differences and the key people and the art forms and the countries that they come from. I think that it all fits into kind of there's like 8 characteristics that we may not have all of them. The readings, for example, very important. But that's what makes a faith so exciting. And I think those are the things that we need to explore.
And I think there's a certain richness that's part of any religion, whether it's the Orthodox that we're focusing on today, or Catholicism, denominations in the Protestant community, those old Oriental Eastern religions, some that are older than time. There's a whole sense of that we celebrate something that's important within us. And that celebration ultimately points to one supreme being, to God. And that's fundamental as to who we are as people of faith. Even, I'm thinking of Confucianism, for example, that whole thing of it's a non-theistic religion, and yet there's this respect. Let's go, we're about 3 minutes into our ending, and we would be remiss if in the Orthodox tradition we did not talk about Mary, the Theotokos, as the God-bearer. Mary is very significant, not only for us as Catholics, but in particular for the Orthodox. Why this God-bearer? What made Mary so special and significant?
Well, what were you saying about the color blue?
The color blue is human, and red depicts the divine life. And so Mary as
the instrument that brings together the human and the divine in more than one way. That is a mystery, isn't it? That is a beautiful. She's a figure in so many different religions. In Islam, highly respected. In the Lutheran faith tradition that we just talked about recently, again, a woman of faith that can be imitated, but herself being the Christ bearer, being the matriarch of the church, being the queen. All those images that we have for her, that we see in some of this art. Mary is as queen of heaven. Mary is the patriarch of Jesus. It's kind of a figure that is so intimate to so many different faith traditions, and especially in this one, as we were talking about, their art particularly.
Oftentimes, if my experience of going into an Orthodox church is the icon of Mary is larger than life. It's huge. It's the whole apse is of the Blessed Mother. And so how significant that she was the vehicle, she was the instrument that brought us the Christ, the Savior of the world, and how important that is for us. We're down to our final seconds. Sister Nancy Dawson, thank you so much for being with us on our series on world religions. Thank you for your input and for the wonderful experience that you bring to our CTNY programming.
Well, every dialogue is informative and growthful, and I've learned so much by our own exchange, things that I did not know, and I'm sure there are things you did not know. Now, if we could get the rest of the world to have a little bit of this dialogue, sometimes we would be a community that lives in human harmony in Jesus Christ.
We thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
World Religions was produced by CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Sister Nancy Dawson.